G'day Legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you are having a great week. Now Legends, of course as always we do have a lot to go from the battlefield to politics, tactics, strategy, operational victories and losses, a little bit of everything because an attritional prolonged war like this, protracted war, this is not just battles to be won or lost. It is a holistic political endeavour of war. I think this is something that so many people struggle to get their head around in this, being so used to insurgency style warfare, this stop and start of victory and loss. But where we talk about holistic wars, you don't need to win a single battle. You don't need to maintain every single position to be able to actually win this style of war. And the realist view that many realists see that war is a legitimate tool of politics and the Liberals not seeing this at all due to inalienable human rights. We can talk on that more down the line if you would like. But of course, we're going to be looking at the maps. We're going to look at a chopper going down and how that does, of course, we've spoken about the battle space in the air is so much more dangerous than it has been in previous wars. And this is going to go into everything of middling, smaller powers, how that will influence air superiority or dominance too. We need to look at Europe, Russia, the tensions increasing there, what we've been speaking about for a couple of days. And are we right near an Archduke Franz Ferdinand style moment? And in that, we're going to look at how war like this, protracted war historically, gets more and more brutal as it continues. As your initial moral ethics, and restrictions are jettisoned as war goes on. And then we'll look at the military industry, see where in the arms race that we have entered and we will enter over the next decade or so, of where states are looking to capitalise on this, where there are going to be issues. And we're going to look at what's happening for Turkey's new 5th generation fighter. That tells us a lot. And then we'll look at India. We'll look at Indonesia in that also. So Legends, a fair bit. Thank you for being with me for this time today. Now, we spoke about in the air. Now, we have seen multiple times helicopters be very, very close to being struck by FPV drones. For memory, we have seen a couple of strikes previously, but this is the most clear footage that we have in the Pokrovsk direction, a Ukrainian FPV drone against a Russian helicopter from the drone in the Pokrovsk region, seeing this helicopter and then striking right underneath on the crew department here. You can actually see a soldier in the side. Now, a lot of the footage is cutting off after the strike. It does appear like this helicopter was able to make some sort of very critical emergency landing. But what is being said is that the crew in the back of this helicopter has been killed, but the pilots may have survived, potentially auto-rotating down there onto the ground. As we can see, a Car 52 then coming across the top. Of course, Car 52 significantly less vulnerable to a strike like this, of course, with the counter-rotating blades on top and being a lot heavily more armed. But this is the battle space in the air that has become already very chockers from mortars and artillery being there, but now all of the drones, this impacting from helicopters to fighter aircraft. We've seen footage of Su-25s being within inches of striking these drones in the air, and this does need to be taken into account of any war going forward. So let's have a look at the maps. Let's look where things are moving around. Of course, here is Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check, this is indicating any Russian advancement over the last 24 hours. And we do have some interesting ones today. So the first we're going to look at is around the Velika Novosilka Huliopol front, where Russia continues grinding, making ground here as far as kilometre squares. This is the most amount of ground that we are seeing shift day on day on day on this axis. Now let's have a look at the Suryak map. Now he is speaking about this. He has been keeping up as well. Again, it's not looking like the deep state where the deep state is just showing individual advancements here. This is more looking like that grinding forward of what we would expect, but entering Verbove and areas like Stepove coming under control. So this is Stepove, the entry into Verbove, which this map is pretty close to showing. So we can see entry into Verbove fairly close. We zoom in one more, you can see Stepove here Now, what you can see the porosity of the front line in here. Now, likely this is highly serving a dose of grey zone in here, that it is stepping forward. But eventually, even if it does look like this, the red zone will catch up and will be exploited into larger territorial gains. So keep an eye on that. I think a lot of the maps are painting a better picture than it may actually be in this area. And we've looked at the fortifications and some of the issues that will arise in this front line if it continues on the trajectory that it is and nothing is being redeployed into here large enough that looks like it will be able to stabilize or even at best slow down what is occurring. Let's then look at Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk northern sector. Now, this map is catching up on the Russian advancements in the direction of Sofivka. There is geolocated footage today of Ukrainian drones striking Russian targets just where my cursor is at the moment. So we know there's at least grey zone out to there, and there's like multiple envelopment that is happening, both Russia and Ukraine, to the north of Pokrovsk. Let's have a look at Suryak. See, he shows this right up to that reservoir, but also further cutting in and around Boykivka on this western push that has come out, and further Ukraine pushing deeper in the direction, at least between Popov Yar and Kopteve in the Volodymyrivka front line. What I'll say, this area at the moment, as you can see by these maps, it's difficult to get an idea, but it is a mess. And both Russia and Ukraine are vulnerable in this sector at the moment. Let's further have a look at Pokrovsk. We'll zoom out a little bit. We have then, of course, AMK's mapping here saying that the Russians have recaptured the village of Dorozhny in the Dobropilia direction. We zoom back in, and this is Dorozhny right here. Remember, Thorkill has been saying this for some days too, and he said if the Russians have got Dorozhny, Nikolaevka is under their control as well in direction of Beletsky. And you can just see where the confusion comes in this sector, but it will be cleared up in time, but that may take a while. Let's zoom right out, come back up into the north and look at Kupiansk and this sector where the grey zone has, of course, expanded right out to Sobolivka and right down into even the southern parts of Kupiansk over the past days. Let's look at Suryak's map. He's showing this grey is red. During the last 3 days, Russian army continued advancing inside Kupiansk city. Recon groups went beyond the city centre until they reached Savsizka Street in the vicinity of the bridge. Further southwest, Russian forces reached this micro-district as well. Fighting continues in a diffuse and intermittent manner, building by building, basement by basement. Meanwhile, in the eastern part of the city, Ukrainian army managed to eliminate all Russian troops that had infiltrated there 2 weeks ago. So in this part, just in the east. And this is going to be a very, very complex defensive operation for the Ukrainians in Kupiansk, especially to the eastern side, with the Oskil splitting this in 2 as we see this envelopment further forming. Let's go south from here, come down into this sort of double envelopment that we've got from then the Pishane front to Terny, this Borova envelopment, and then from Terny all the way through Seversk Solidar front. We can see some red check on here, the last remaining parts of the Kremenar forest that stood for multiple years. Now we have Serebryanka down in here, and AMK saying that Serebryanka has come under Russian control. So this sector right in here, and as you can see, this finger coming through to Dronivka and Serebryanka, showing many maps that this area, even by the grey zone of this, is starting to close up. And once that does, the battle for Seversk will really be officially begun, at least the further break-ins into that area, exploiting the envelopment on the south and the north. So further up in here, you'll be familiar with Yampil, Zarachny. So further breaking into Yampil, said to be by Suryak, and further exploitation just to the west of Toshke, where we have Zarachny. Sorry, my map is not popping up. The labeling in here, apologies, but in this sector, further advancement. Again, this is all part of the same beneficial movement in the north and the south. But Seversk, there's a lot of movement to the south of here as well. We have seen grey zone increase by the deep state map over the past week in Vremimka. And this is further confirmed by a geolocation today. So in this geolocation, we see a Russian soldier just here clearing some of these trench systems. This is geolocated just to the northwest of Vremimka, some 4 kilometers back from the closest part. Now, Syriac maps, he shows this movement on this map here in the same general area. So we do see further movements on the south, further movements in the north. One thing I have said about the south is in some of this footage, it is like a moonscape down here. And to actually gain positions, hold positions is going to be very, very difficult. But keep an eye on this. Then we'll move right out and right into the extreme north into Sumy. So let's have a look on the Syriac maps in here. During the last week, Ukraine Army recaptured serious positions south of the lakes near the international border. So just on the western side of where Russia has pushed across, right in and around Konstantinivka, this direction in these lakes that you can see there. And then from the north, we'll push right down into the south. We have Orokhiv, Mala, Tokmachka, where we did have both geolocated footage and maps showing Russia's western push into here. We do have, as a result, positional battles. Ukraine Army managed to recapture some positions southeast of Mala, Tokmachka during the month of September. But again, this is in this sector here, what was never shown under red or even grey. Remember, informationally, this area in here is, I believe, has the least amount of incentive to show any advancement due to the 23 offensive in that direction. So let's have a look more on the European side of politics and what is at the moment just growing more and more tense and really setting the stage for probing, getting out of control, or potentially even an action to lead to further justification and give that casus belli that we've spoken about again and again. Politico has this. Leaders press to reshape the EU under Putin's aggressive shadow. And this is something you and I have discussed a lot, is the militarization of the EU, where the EU used to sit in politics and economics and NATO used to sit as the military arm. The EU is getting more and more militarized. And I've actually said before, it does seem, even to recent days, that the Kremlin is okay with Ukraine joining the EU. It'll be interesting to see as the EU becomes more and more militarized, if that then actually changes. We will see. So, scrambling fighter jets is NATO's job. This is said by a senior EU official. The EU's job is to be ready to be in the position we need to be when we have to respond, to enhance our readiness and to have the tools to be able to react to the threats when needed, reinforcing common tools and capabilities in the face of common threats. So the military side, but of course, attritional protracted war is really a battle of economics. So that is to support that, but it's not there to be scrambling fighter aircraft. Acknowledging the risk posed by Moscow, they say this is the easy part. How to respond within the EU, the European Union, full of competing priorities, is another. Again, you've got 27 states, all with, of course, different priorities in the way that they see the world. At least they can agree on a bottom line. Doing nothing makes all-out war more likely. To fix that English, I got stuck on trying to read that 10 times. The challenges for European leaders in Copenhagen is to find a deterrence equilibrium with an increasingly risk-seeking Russian leadership that allows for effective management of such incidents, short of them spiralling into a crisis or then potentially into conflict. It's very difficult when the US president, the biggest ally in the NATO alliance, the most amount of firepower, says, well, feel free to shoot down Russian jets. But whether I have your backs, well, I don't know. And this has somewhat tied the hands of the European nations. If there is a breach of airspace again, the US has said shoot them down. If they don't, how's it going to look? And of course, we've seen Europe is not willing to make any real moves without the US. Of course, Germany, historically Europe's greatest military power, is far weaker than it should be given the nature of their economy, their population, and history as well. And if you are wondering why the state of German defence is in the state of which it is, it makes more sense when you find out that von der Leyen was the former defence minister. But yet, this dangerous phase of European politics is strewn with potential disasters. Privately, government officials have expressed worries about the prospect of a Franz Ferdinand moment. Of course, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is that trigger for the First World War, but of course, the leading up increasing tensions before that as well. This is exactly why we have said a false flag could potentially work right now. Now, Zelensky, he says a lot like this. Putin will not wait to finish his war in Ukraine. He will open up some other direction. There's a lot in this. This is often what we call Schrodinger's Putin. That Putin is ready to take over the world, but also he's ready to collapse and is being completely defeated in Ukraine. And it has to be one or the other. These are mutually exclusive. And I pose you the question, who benefits most from a two-front war and extension at the moment? Now, Putin won't wait to finish his war. He'll open up another front. In my opinion, and Putin knowing Russia's history, he's way too calculated to risk fighting on two fronts. Fighting on two fronts has been the kryptonite of many major powers. Russia, they have gained military victory through overextension, two-front wars of countries. They have suffered from being overextended themselves historically also. And Putin, his leadership calculations, I don't think that they will make this mistake again. And a great case study to back this up is Syria. When we saw Syria falling and Russia not willing to move assets in to try and stabilize that or try and recover what they had done, we saw them let it go. I think that gives us the best case study to see, and that is Syria not wanting to overextend. We're talking about Syria. We're not talking about extending into NATO and the repercussions that could happen there. As with everything, let's follow the money. If the fundamentals of defence draw general consensus, even with Europe bitterly divided politically between a crumbling centre ground and a rising populist right, how to pay for what needs to come next is pitting leader against leader. What the EU will do against a populist right is just ban the people who are running. But how to pay for it is very difficult, as that centre does just non-exist anymore in these states. The EU's transformation into effective global power costs money, and not all capitals are aligned on just how it should be spent, let alone on what. Military leaders insist Europe is already dealing with a low-intensity war with Russia. Historically, they say, wars have been won only with public debt, and a signal the EU is ready to spend can form part of the deterrence. Again, do you not, maybe I'm going crazy, but setting the stage for more debt to come and rising costs. Speak about this through wars as well, and where countries are sitting slightly differently. But there's nothing like the threat of invasion to focus the mind. And as we see, where people are on different trajectories, the threat of existential war can bring people together. Diplomats said they hope the growing threats will help reach decisions they would previously had been reluctant to make. Diplomats saying it's a difficult balance because you don't want to terrify people, but you want leaders to be aware of the risks enough to take them seriously. And this is what I've been saying about Russian probing. Is the probes hitting defence industries using intelligence operations, maybe minor drones, maybe incursions? These will never be above the threshold that the populations in these nations feel that Russia is an existential threat. And Russia will purposely keep them below that threshold in case of further support or kinetic actions into Ukraine. And this is why we have speculated that there may be an event that happens, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand moment, that then has the casus belli, so justification for further actions. And that's where we've said it doesn't make sense for Russia to extend on this. And I don't care what these European leaders are saying. And this is where NATO and Europe, they can't figure out their own narrative. Russophrenia, the fear that Russia is ready to take over the world, yet is collapsing at the same time. What is it? Is it they're getting ready to move in and annex the Baltics and this and that? Or a few more $1 billion to Ukraine and they're going to push back to Moscow? This is where that is at odds. And this is where I've said a lot of this, from tax-paying money, further debt, all of this, it fucking sounds to me like, hey, look, this, we've put all our chips in here. We need something so people don't rise up against billions and billions and billions more going. Isolating Orban. Time is not on the European Union side. Ukraine faces a budget shortfall of about $23 billion next year, giving governments just months to deliver a sizable pot of cash that can sustain Kyiv's war effort. Von der Leyen believes she's found the answer in the shape of 140 billion euros reparations loan that's financed and sanctioned by Russian cash. The cash would come from Russian assets frozen. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is standing in the way of the European Union's plan to seize the assets, but the Commission thinks they've found a legal workaround to cut Hungary out of the decision-making process. And this is what we see more and more, tearing down the very foundations of these institutions in the name of national security. Now, it may be. The problem is, once you tear away the foundations, your risk of doing it again and on different instances increases more and more. And you'll do it again and again and again, and therefore really reduces the credibility of institutions like this. The goal in Copenhagen is to gather sufficient support from other countries to isolate Orban. But we're in a grey area. This gentleman here, the director of the Europe, Russia and Eurasia program at the Washington-based think tank, the SIS, is saying, I don't think there's any interest in wanting to confront Vladimir Putin getting in a shooting war of any kind to defend socialist Europeans. Having already imposed heavy sanctions, Europe has no obvious silver bullet left. Again, this is why we've spoken about casus belli in Greece event, can an event to further expand and extend the war. Now, overall, I just don't see that any real major power has the incentive to see a real end to this conflict. The US, they are taking, through Trump, an alt-capitalist approach and shifting blame, whether it's shifting onto Biden, whether it's shifting onto Putin, whether it's shifting onto Zelensky, they're taking the ultimate capitalist approach. You guys fight all you want. We're not going to give you money, but we have this fantastic store of all these weapons you can buy. And because your energy is now cut off, well, you'll have to buy our energy as well. While there's no risk ultimately to US mainland themselves. This is especially appealing as the US economy faces pressure and US itself faces an international legitimacy crisis following actions in the Middle East over the last couple of decades, but especially over the last 18 months. On the other hand, China, well, they get access to otherwise sanctioned Russian resources. They get these very cheap, and Russia is looking to offload all of this. And the West, they're stuck in a protracted, very costly war. While China is just growing in power and not sending any of their military systems at all. And this also weakens a threat historically to China. It weakens Russia. Now, Russia and China, they may be on the same trajectory of anti-West at the moment. It doesn't matter because militarily you don't balance against intent. You balance against capability because intent can change very, very quickly. Look at countries in which we fought who we're now friends with. This is where I've said, I think in time we'll actually see rising tensions as Europe remilitarizes between France and Germany. Now, I'm not saying there's intent, but the capability there in his story, I still think we're going to see a little bit more tension over the coming decades. But China, as we know, in you use barbarians to control barbarians, or people say, let barbarians fight barbarians. China's sitting back and going, look, we're getting all these resources way cheaper. Russia's desperate to offload them. Russia is getting weakened somewhat militarily by this war. And again, you balance against capability, not intent. America's sending a lot of equipment. They're losing legitimacy in the Middle East. Europe's sending a lot of equipment, struggling on the manufacturing base. Again, this is why I see there's no real appetite in China or America to actually end this war. But as this war continues on, it's going to become more and more brutal, and history shows us this as well. The best person who talks about this is Iskander Rahman in Planning for Protraction. Let's go through this. Throughout history, short war thinking has all often run aground on the jagged shoals of political reality, with states repeatedly underestimating the amount of pain and devastation their determined adversaries could absorb prior to even contemplating surrender. After much expenditure of blood treasure, war termination is rendered all the more elusive by the desire to honour sunk cost, the sunken cost fallacy, and by the resultant escalation of commitments serving to justify earlier military investments and sacrifices. As Fred Eichel noted, the greater the enemy's effort, the costs in fighting a war, the more he will become committed to his own conditions for peace, thus rendering the prospect of any mutually acceptable resolution all the more difficult. Exactly what we're in at the moment. Protraction also tends to breed brutality, whether through deliberate or inadvertent escalation, as increasingly frustrated and vengeful antagonists progressively jettison their self-imposed operational restrictions and moral reservations, ratcheting up levels of aggression before eventually engaging in total warfare. In April 1915, the German forces, in violation of the Hague Convention of 1899, introduced poison gas to the Western Front, deploying more than 170 tonnes of chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders positioned along a 4-mile stretch of the trenches. French and British outrage led to their developing and employing their own chemical arsenal. During the Second World War, despite some countries' prior moral qualms, all parties engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare and mass aerial bombardment of civilian targets. So exactly what we're talking about, that's going to get more and more brutal, especially as we see further deterioration in states as the war is fought to a conclusion. Such escalating spirals of brutality, particularly if they are seen to have been triggered by a major violation of pre-existing cultural norms, naturally also fuel protraction by rendering a mutually acceptable settlement all the more elusive, thus spawning something of a vicious cycle. In short, the longer a conflict lasts, the harder it is to bring to a mutually satisfactory and decisive close, exactly where we are now, and that this is going to get more and more brutal. And as a lot of nations have put all their chips in this basket, do not be surprised to have massive efforts for saving what could be existential to states and ideologies also. We're already seeing self-imposed restrictions around democracy being jettisoned to come down on these parties of which you don't like, finding ways around legal loopholes in the EU, use of weapons, use of this, use of that, absolutely. And this all goes down to collapse and heavier weapons being used potentially from Russia as well. So again, it's going to get more brutal before we see an end to this, because it has been accepted, I believe, that this war is going to be fought to a military conclusion. Let's have a look at this, because we're talking about arms races that are going to start. From Indian media, India looks to procure S-4 and S-500 air defense systems from Russia. 2018 contract with Russia for 5 S-400 systems had a follow-on clause for 5 more. The S-400 has been described as a game changer for shooting down 5 Pakistan fighter jets in Op Sindor. Now, any shooting down of these jets, please take it with a grain of salt, especially when you hear the word game changer. But what we do know is that this weapon system is not a bad system at all. Don't listen to what the propaganda will tell you. Remember when F-16s were going to be flying over Moscow? People sold shirts about this. What have we not seen? Yeah, you're right. Whether it's an S-400, a Patriot, or whatever, neither of these, and no air defense system, has a counter for absolute mass. Israel and Iran's missiles is a great example of this. Now, impressed by the defensive arc, deterrence, and punitive capability of its 3 S-400 Triumph systems, India is looking at procuring additional long-range air defense systems. Now, India, they seek to balance power between the other great states and balance sovereignty as well. So by buying and having some Western systems, some Russian systems, it balances that no country can completely cut that off. Also giving India some chips saying, well, we won't buy this system, or we won't have this system, we'll buy yours if you give us sanctions relief or tariffs or any of those. India is considering the possibility of acquiring the latest S-500 from Russia. Now, what we do know, this follow-on clause, so it was for the original S-400s and then 5 more. The follow-on clause means that more systems can be bought at the same price, or considering any dollar value escalation or inflation costs. So it could get a good deal on these. Defense Secretary says about how he's impressed with this system and looking to procure the S-500. Russia, which is yet to deliver the last remaining 2 air defense systems, has promised to complete the contract by September next year, but it does depend how things are going to play out in this war. But we do know that there is a coming arms race. It's already there, but it will increase over the next years, next decade. And it will be very interesting to see how states do acquire weapons from the big hitters, from the US, from China, from Russia, from South Korea, and of course India increasing their own domestic capability too, because what we do know is Russia, China, India, they will take advantage of Western sanctions and interests also, and that a lot of countries are being cut off specific systems, therefore forcing them to move where they're getting their equipment. And this is a big one over the past week. Turkey says US Congress blocking engine exports for its Khan next-gen fighter jet. That the export license for the General Electric 110 engines powering the first prototypes of the jets is adding pressure on Ankara's efforts to deliver its ambitious fifth generation, that they're not getting the license for this engine. Turkey's foreign minister saying the engines are waiting for approval in the US Congress, but the licenses had been suspended. Turkey is looking for this engine as a buffer until they can create their own indigenous engine. But this is multiple years away. Very, very few countries actually make their own highly efficient jet engines. Until that point, US engines, they remain the bottleneck for flight testing, low-rate production and export commitments. Ankara is saying there's going to be no delays. Turkey's defence industry has been under sanctions since 2019 acquisition of Russian S-400 Triumph missile systems, with restrictions under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA. Now, CAATSA, this is just an unrestricted US power play. It punishes countries that deal with adversaries, whether real or potential, or even just competing interest, while giving the US military and industrial complex remaining having a captive market, because we will sanction you if you look to buy from anyone that may be competing, not only militarily, but just competing on strategic commercial interests too. It undermines Allies' sovereignty and exposes Washington's rules-based order as nothing more than no by America's rules. And this can be used basically blanket against anything. As you see, Turkey, we're a NATO country under this sanction. India, there's been threats thrown out. Indo, there's been threats. There's been multiple threats thrown out, even to Vietnam. Presidency of Defence Industries has insisted the program faces no delays and emphasised that Ankara does not plan to depend on a single supplier for engines. And what a lot are saying is similar to what Defence Security Asia say. Defence analysts on Turkish media platform and social networks have urged Ankara to explore engine options from Russian Saturn AL-41 or China's WS-15 programs, though such moves would carry enormous political consequences. In June, developer Turkish Aerospace Industries signed an agreement to sell as many as 48 Khan jets to Indonesia. Indonesia has previously had warnings from the US regarding CAATSA. But what we may see is more and more in this arms race that we speak about and going, look, if you're not going to sell us this high-end air defence system and you're going to sanction us if we buy this air defence system from someone else, we're not going to go without, we're going to buy it. And this is where Turkey may sit. Turkey may go, look, yes, you're going to sanction us further, but we see that that carries less risk than not having a fifth generation fighter. And we may see a lot of countries from Indonesia to Turkey to others looking further at Chinese, Russian or Indian defence supplies rather than American, definitely not European. Europe is not competing anywhere near with these big suppliers. South Korea has basically undercut Europe's defence industry in many, many areas. Look at Poland buying everything from tanks to SPGs from the ROK. The biggest thing for many nations is the ability to have mass and the ability to maintain further manufacturing if there is increase in global tensions, which there is. And this is why India is buying some parts from here, some parts from over here. So no single nation, no single ideology, no single country can cut down and completely cut them off militarily. That's that sovereignty balancing that we have seen. Legends, I really struggled getting through this video. My brain is not working, but you have a fantastic day and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.